We've done port scanning, we've done enumeration. But port scanning by itself does not tell us if a service is truly vulnerable. For that, we need to do a vulnerability scan. So let's talk about that. Let's first talk about vulnerabilities. A vulnerability is a weakness that might be exploitable. And it's not just necessarily in technology. It could be in people, like they are vulnerable to being phished or social engineered. It could be in processes, the way we move things in and out of the loading dock. There are plenty of opportunities for someone to sneak into the facility. Or they could be in technology, like this particular web server has vulnerabilities. You can, and probably do, have vulnerabilities you're not aware of. Or you could have vulnerabilities that are known, but no one has yet created an exploit for. Vulnerabilities have classifications. First, misconfigurations. I didn't configure this system properly. I didn't apply secure settings. I didn't configure per best practice. Didn't turn on no antivirus. Or I left defaults in place, defaults that add vulnerability, default configurations, default services, default passwords. Or maybe there are known code weaknesses and I haven't patched it, so it's susceptible to buffer overflows. Or maybe just I've got whole systems that are unpatched, not just a particular known weakness. I'm not applying security updates from the vendor. Maybe there are flaws in the design. The software had a hurried development process with insufficient built-in security. Gee, does that ever happen? Yeah, all the time. Companies are in a hurry to get a product out to market. Security is an afterthought. Oh, we'll just send it out as a patch. Just sell it real quick first. Yeah, okay. The operating system could have flaws. We've discovered vulnerabilities in the OS. We've discovered vulnerabilities in applications running on the OS or services that automatically ship with an OS. Or there are services that freely permit client connections with no authentication or security controls. TFTP, FTP allowing anonymous connections, yeah. Maybe there are user-based vulnerabilities. The user is susceptible to social engineering. They haven't been trained properly. They lack good awareness for security. There could be process-based vulnerabilities. Like I said, there are security gaps in how we do stuff, which allow exploitation by an attacker. Susie Q goes out for coffee all the time and leaves the whole lobby unattended, and there's no camera, so I can plant things there, different devices, a rogue Wi-Fi device, whatever. So let's scan for vulnerabilities. We could scan for not only vulnerabilities, but also compliance. When you do vulnerability scanning, you can choose with some of the scanners. You can say, I'm trying to scan for compliance for some regulation, or just give me known vulnerabilities that you find. When you scan, you should include both physical devices and VMs, virtual systems, VMs and containers. Usually you'll use an automated tool to do vulnerability scanning, and it'll do host discovery and port scanning as part of the scan. Now, some tools only rattle the doorknob. They'll see if the vulnerability exists. They'll send something and see if they get the right response back and goes, oh yeah, that thing's not been patched. But they won't try to actually exploit the vulnerability. On the other hand, there are tools such as Metasploit Pro, which is a paid GUI version of Metasploit that runs on Windows. They will try to automatically exploit the vulnerability so they can provide proof. Steal a file, obtain a command prompt, a shell, something. Most tools, if it's a good tool, will refer to whatever the discovered vulnerability is by its CVE number, Common Vulnerability and Exposure Number. And they'll provide links to give you additional information and recommendations. Most tools, the good ones, will produce reports for you. Some tools will use standard output, so you can import the output. You can take the output from the scan and import it into another tool for, say, validation. How would we approach vulnerability scanning? Well, You could just sit there with a sniffer and just watch the traffic that goes by. That would be the least alerting. Nobody would notice, hopefully. Just passively sniff, see what you get. You could do active scanning, and this is what we tend to do. Send probes and specially crafted requests to targets, see what you get back. First of all, host discovery, what hosts are live. Port scans, service enumeration, what are the open ports, the services, their versions. Then rattle the doorknob, see if the OS or the service responds in a way that suggests that it's susceptible, meaning it wouldn't respond like this if it was patched. Doesn't mean you have to actually launch an attack to compromise the device or the service. Usually you would do this in a pen test where we do validation. We just want to know what potentially are the vulnerabilities. And a lot of scanners, they would prefer you give them a credential. We call it a credential scan. If you give the scanner some kind of credential, it doesn't have to necessarily be the admin, that will allow the service or the scanner to log in and get even more information out. So many services, if the scan is credentialed, you'll just get more info. So you could do uncredentialed scans, but they won't give you just as much information. They're going to rely on external resources for the configuration settings. What kinds of tools are out there? You could have host-based vulnerability scanning to check for the operating system, services, apps, versions, patch levels, defaults, and misconfigurations. You could have network-based that check protocols and ports, access control lists, firewall rules, intrusion detection, intrusion prevention. You could have cloud-based, getting more and more popular. These are comprehensive solutions. They'll even emulate attacks. They're good for what we call DevSecOps, development security operations. These are teams that will continuously, usually they use containers just to virtualize only specific apps, and they'll constantly send updates to these containers. These cloud-based tools will often, I think probably typically at this point, use artificial intelligence for advanced analysis. You could also do depth assessment. We could use fuzzers. Now, when you fuzz something, you're sending a whole bunch of weird information to an application to see if it starts to misbehave. You're looking for previously unknown vulnerabilities. Ooh, if it is responsive to fuzzing, maybe I could even find out if I can do a buffer overflow, create a brand new buffer overflow exploit. A good vulnerability scanner is going to have an inference-based approach. It'll assess vulnerabilities depending on the protocols that it finds in the environment. It will inventory protocols, it'll detect open ports, it'll identify services behind the ports, it'll check for vulnerabilities, validate that they really are exploitable. It can be automated, usually it is. It will have a signature database that you can regularly update. It will support different types of networks and hosts. It will suggest proper remedies and workarounds for vulnerabilities. It can imitate outside attackers. This is why the cloud-based stuff is really good, because they're constantly updating it. It will create actionable, customizable reports. It'll include trends and categories by severity. Now, vulnerability scanners do have their limits. They're just a start. They're just one part of the larger penetration test. And if they are a typical vulnerability scanner, they'll only look for known signatures, kind of like an antivirus scanner would look for known signatures, which means you're going to have to be constantly updating. Automated tools can produce a lot of false positives, and I got to tell you this, so many of these vulnerability scanners, they'll produce all of these results, which only a tiny fraction could actually be exploited. But they want to look good, so they give you all these results, right? And they'll produce false positives or things that just are not exploitable. Automated tools only focus on technology. They don't evaluate vulnerabilities in people and processes. You're going to need a skilled pen tester, social engineer to do that. Just because you have a list of vulnerabilities that show up in a scanner, you're going to need to run a real penetration test. This is where you, the ethical hacker, comes in, right? You're going to need to determine, can this truly be compromised? And vulnerability scanners, if they're too aggressive, they can destabilize fragile systems or interfere with normal operations. They're likely to be incomplete if you don't supply them a credential. There are a ton of popular vulnerability scanners. Some are free, some cost you quite a bit of money. We play with some of these. Some of them are very comprehensive. Just showing you a few of these here. Here's an example of the Greenbone Security Assistant. And here's an example of what it finds. Out of 94, I found 43 results. I can see the severity level here, and I can see the host and where it is, and I can see the vulnerability, and I can see some CVSS statistics. So here's one example of output. Python is a very popular scripting language, and as scripting languages go, it's relatively easy to learn. So you can install it on pretty much any platform, Linux, Windows, Mac OS, iOS, Android. And you can write your own scripts for customized vulnerability scanning to automate some specific task and parse or take apart and analyze the results. Python's really good for that. Python is actually used in a number of commercial scanning tools. GitHub has many Python hacking tools that other people have written that you can download and run. Here's an example right here. So I've got a Gmail hack, and this is just the beginning. I need to import these various modules, and then we just begin. And the script will probably be quite long. So that's just one example of a Python script. Python, of course, is only one example of a programming language that you could use to create your own hacking tools. It's just that it's very, very popular. Here's an example of a Python port scanner. Now, I'm not trying to teach you Python per se, but okay, so I'm importing various modules here, and then I'm basically asking for the user to enter the host to be scanned, and then I'm going to get that target, and I'm going to print to the user, just throw onto the console saying, I'm starting to scan on host, and then whatever they put in. And then I'm going to say, okay, a range from 50 to 500 right here. I am going to try to open these various ports from 50 to 500, or from 1 to 1023, or 1 to 65535, whatever you like. And if I do manage to open them up, I'm going to say, hey, port such and such is open. So there's an example of a Python port scanner. Then we have something called Security Content Automation Protocol, SCAP. This is a framework of specifications, and the idea is for automated configuration, vulnerability and patch checking, technical control compliance, security measurements. The National Vulnerability Database uses it. It's an industry standard, and SCAP scanners are typically used to test for compliance. If to be in compliance with this or that regulation or something that your company wants, we want a certain level of security, we use the SCAP scanner to test to see if we are in compliance with that requirement. So that's typically what a SCAP scanner is used for. So the SCAP framework has all of these things, like we have the platforms and the vulnerabilities and the scoring system, the configurations, the config checklists, and the assessment languages. Here's an example of a SCAP compliance checker. This is a GUI tool, SCAP compliance checker 5.4, and we can say, okay, well, which one do we want to be in compliance with? You check these, and it'll scan and give us some results. Here would be a scenario. You're creating baseline system images, so you're creating something that you're going to deploy out using some imaging tool. The images will be used to remediate vulnerabilities found in different operating systems. So in other words, if this thing is found to be vulnerable, it has malware, whatever, We're going to just re-image it. But before any of the images can be deployed, they need to be scanned for malware and vulnerabilities. Obviously, you don't want your golden images to have malware or vulnerabilities by themselves. You'd be putting that on all the other machines. You need to ensure configurations meet industry standard benchmarks and that the baseline creation process can be repeated frequently. So what are you doing? You can use a SCAP plugin on the operating system to check the OS against known good baselines. Why did I show you this scenario? You might see it. Here is an example of what vulnerability scanner output might look like. It should have a dashboard, it should have summaries, it should have details for each device, it should have output for both physical and virtual hosts. You should see device name, type, IP address, MAC address, the operating system version, the open TCP and UDP ports, installed applications and running services, any discovered vulnerabilities, bad default settings, misconfigurations. You should see accounts with weak or default passwords, files and folders with weak permissions, technology or device-specific problems, missing patches, missing hotfixes, end-of-life, end-of-service software information. The higher-end scanning tools will separate the report into an executive summary and then the technical details, because the boss does not want to get bogged down in the weeds. They just want to know what does this mean in boss language? And then the technical people, you, will see the actual details about every single host. And hopefully you'll see the details in a way that you could even reproduce the problem if you wanted to. It should include CVE, and CVSS references. So what's the CVE number? What is the vulnerability level? It should include recommendations to correct or mitigate any discovered issues, which often will be patch or disable or something like that. And here's an example. I think this is Nexpose. So we can see, you should be able to click any of these things and drill down farther. When we get scan results, there are 4 categories of results, and you need to know the difference between them. First is the true positive. Yes, we truly detected a real vulnerability. It really exists. The scan did its job. Okay, let's fix it. Then there's the true negative. Phew, we don't have any vulnerabilities. We truly don't have any. The scan was correct. It didn't miss anything. We prefer this result. Of course, it's going to be rare, very rare, right? Then there's the false positive. The scanner is telling us there are vulnerabilities, but these are fake. They're false. They don't truly exist. And you get too many of these, and it can be annoying, because now you don't know what's true and what isn't. And then you have the worst one, the false negative. We didn't find anything. There's no problem here. But there is. It just missed it. We actually have a vulnerability and we didn't see it, and we don't know that it exists. This is our worst result. We don't want the falses at all, but false negative, that's the worst. In our report, we're going to have these common elements. You're going to have the executive summary, the major findings, the information about the scan, like the tools and the scope, the targets that we went after, the results, the details of the targets, the vulnerability classifications like the CVE references or the CVSS, the scores, from 1 to 10, the threat assessment, the recommendations, and the summary. Here's one example. Here is a vulnerability report from Nessus, and it says click here to view and edit the scan results. You should be able to click and drill down. This part here looks like it's in the weeds. We're not looking at the executive summary part right here. We're looking at some of the technical details. So that is looking at vulnerabilities. And now let's go on to the next topic. We will conduct a vulnerability scan against several VMs using OpenVAS. Log into Kali and open a terminal. We need to install OpenVAS first of all, so we'll install it with sudo apt install OpenVAS. Just like that. Press enter. Give the sudo password. Do you want to continue? Yes. Why? Let it rip. When it's done, we'll come back. We're back. Now we need to set up the installer. There are over 50,000 data points that OpenVAS will check for, so we're going to need to download all those signatures. We do that by typing sudo gvm tech setup and hit enter. Look at this really long admin password. We need to jot this down somewhere, because if we lose this, we're in trouble. This installation is going to take a while. We'll come back when it's done. And we are back. That took a little bit, but we have all of the updated signatures. Make sure you've copied that password somewhere. As this thing says, we can run gvm check tech setup to make sure everything is correctly configured. We're going to do that. Sudo gvm check tech setup. Press enter. The sudo password for Kali is Kali. I see a bunch of OKs. OK. Checking services are up and running. Starting it, waiting for it. This is looking good so far. We'll pause the video again and come back as soon as it's done. Back again, and it looks like our installation finished okay. Excellent. Let's prepare some targets to scan. As you can see, I have a number of virtual machines open. You can open one or as many as your host can handle. The nice thing is, we don't need to know their exact IP address so long as they're on the same subnet as the Kali machine. OpenVAS will just discover them for us as it does the scan. Let's go back to Kali. I have my admin password handy. Let's open Firefox. And we need to go to our own local host, https://localhost. OpenVAS uses 9392 as the default port. Let's enter. Type in the admin name and either type or paste your password. Sign in. When we come to the dashboard, we don't have anything to show just yet, but that's okay. We'll create a scan. Come up to the Scans tab and just mouse over it and click Tasks. Then you'll see this little magic wand over here, the Task Wizard. Mouse over it and select Advanced Task Wizard. You can give the task a name or just leave the default. I'm leaving the default. You can choose the kind of scan. I'll just choose full and fast. I'm fine with that. And then we can put in the subnet. Subnet ID is 192.168.182.0/24. That's mine. You put in yours. If we had any login credentials, it would give us even more details, but let's just pretend we don't have any. I think we're ready. Click Create. We see that the task is requested. It's meant to start immediately. There it goes. It's running. I'm going to pause this, and when it's done, we'll come back and take a look at our results. Welcome back. I have the dashboard here, and it took so long I had to log in again, but that's okay. I also have exploit.db here, so if we find vulnerabilities, we can see if there is an exploit that has been posted here, so we can take advantage of those vulnerabilities. looks like we have quite a few high-level vulnerabilities and then some mediums and just a few lows and just some things that have been logged. Let's go over to scans, click that, and let's look at the results. It automatically sorts by the most severe results. Wow, 260 pages worth of results. Doesn't mean all of them will be high vulnerabilities. We can see that they belong to several different machines, particularly 131 and 136. If I was interested in sorting by a particular machine, I could just click IP and just pick one of them. I wonder which one this is. I'll just click this one, see which one 136 is. Server 2003. Okay. Let's go back. Let's click this one. Could allow remote code execution. Click that. According to this is Microsoft Bulletin MS09 TAC 001. There's a little description here about the vulnerability. I could just click this and gives us a little bit more information, including CVEs. Let's click back. Let's go back to this again. I want to search ExploitDB, see if anyone has written an exploit for this. The nice thing about ExploitDB is that we can search by Microsoft Bulletin, we could search by CVE, we could search by platform. Let's just see if anyone has put in anything for this Microsoft Bulletin. Enter. Nope, nothing. Okay, that's fine. Let's come back and click this again. Let's keep looking. SMB server, multiple vulnerabilities. Let's click that. MS17-010. I know what that is. Let's go take a look. We're going to copy this. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to paste this in, get rid of that dot there, and enter search. Ooh, Eternal Blue, Eternal Romance. And look at this. There's a Metasploit module. Great. And a few other bits of exploit code that other people have written. We're going to remember this one when we go to Metasploit. Cool. Any others that should catch our attention? Let's go to the next page here. Here's another one. I think we've looked at that already. SMB brute force logins with default credentials. Ooh, I want to read about this. Click this. A number of known default credentials are tried for the login. It was possible to log in with the following credentials via SMB to the IPC $share. Oh, well, we know the username and password off the bat already. Okay, we didn't even have to try to do a password crack on that. Okay, well, this is good. Let's close this up. How about one of the other IPs? Let's just kind of go down the way here. 132. Let's just see if 132 has anything for us. I'm just going to keep on scrolling through here. I saw low level 1. Oh, here are some. Our exec service is running. Remote shell unencrypted clear text login. Well, that's good. How about this? VS FTP server detection. Okay. Let's see this high vulnerability here. The RExec service is running. Click that. Scroll down here. The RExec service was detected on the target. Remote execution client for an exec server. Has the same kind of functionality that remote shell has. You can execute shell commands. Main difference is that RExec authenticate by reading the username and password unencrypted from the socket. So it is a clear text login. Okay. That's pretty cool. What else do we have? VS FTPD server detection. Now this was simply logged, but what is it? Let's click this. Script is grabbing the banner, and this is version 234. VS FTPD version 234. Let's go over to ExploitDB, and let's put in VS FTPD 2.3.4. Any exploits? Backdoor command execution. Nice. There's even a Metasploit module for it. Let's keep that in mind too. We have Metasploit modules now for 2 machines right off the bat. The Server 2003 And what is this thing anyway? Let's click this. This is, if we scroll up and down here, this is an Ubuntu Linux. This will be Metasploitable. All right, that's good. Let's go back. How about we look at this from another angle? Let's go back to scans. Let's go to vulnerabilities. These are the various vulnerabilities that have turned up. Now, if we want to see them by severity, let's click severity. Okay, so there's our exec and some other stuff here. All sorts of interesting things. Look at these high-end vulnerabilities. Keep going. Wow, there's a lot to unpack here. This OpenVAS vulnerability scanner has really given us a lot of stuff. We've been able to find Metasploit modules for 2 of our targets already. Look at all this stuff. Now, some of this may be useful, may not. And by the way, just because it's only logged and doesn't show a severity, it doesn't necessarily mean it's safe. After all, we saw that that version of the FTP server was logged, didn't show any vulnerability, but when we looked it up, there was a Metasploit module for it. We're going to use some of those Metasploit modules a little bit later in some other activities. Now let's move on to the next topic. We've conducted vulnerability scans. Let's see about assessing the vulnerabilities that we find. I mentioned things like CVE and CVSS. Let's see what that's all about. So what is a vulnerability assessment? This is a comprehensive assessment of a system's ability to withstand attack. We're going to look at the output of a vulnerability scan, and we're going to figure out how well could this system resist attack. It's part of our overall security audit. We should also be assessing non-technical vulnerabilities, the people, the processes. We need an actionable report. You'll have a vulnerability scan. That's just one part. We need a more comprehensive vulnerability assessment, which has a comprehensive actionable report. And you'll have all these little vulnerability scans and our findings when we did phishing campaigns and when we tried to sneak in the back door and this sort of stuff. All of this comes into our vulnerability assessment. I've mentioned the CVSS, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. This is an open framework for communicating characteristics and impacts of vulnerabilities, and it uses metrics, things you can measure, for measuring the vulnerabilities. You've got the base metrics, the inherent qualities of a vulnerability, the temporal metrics, features that might keep changing during the lifetime of the vulnerability, or environmental metrics. This is based on a particular environment or implementation. You go from 1, which is the lowest, to 10, which is the most severe, and the National Vulnerability Database keeps track of this. So when I see a CVSS score of 9 or 9.5, I know this is really high up there, because 10.0 is as high as you get in terms of severity, how bad something is. The CVSS metric groups would include things like, for the basic, how exploitable is this thing? What would be the impact? You don't need to memorize this stuff, but it's good to know. Or the temporal metric group, what is the maturity of the exploit code? What is the level of remediation, or how confident are we in this? Or the environmental metric group, what are the requirements for confidentiality, integrity, availability? Now let's talk about the attack vector metrics. The attack vector metric is scored in one of 4 levels. And the word vector just simply means from what angle. Is this a network attack? Are these vulnerabilities remotely exploitable from a couple of routers away, including over the internet? Are they adjacent attacks, meaning that I would have to be on the same physical or logical network. I'm right next to this target that I'm attacking. I'd have to be on the local network. Are they local? I have to actually be logged into this system. I've logged in locally, or via some remote protocol like Secure Shell or RDP. Or maybe I'm going to have to use social engineering or some way to trick an unsuspecting user into initiating the exploit. And then there's physical. Is this a physical attack? Must I physically interact with the target system? I'll just take a hammer to it. Bang! That's my physical attack, right? So these are 4 attack vectors. We have complexity metrics. So this indicates conditions beyond the attacker's control, but must be in place in order for the vulnerability to be exploited. So you either have got to get the user to inadvertently help you, or you got to have specific configurations or misconfigurations or non-configurations that we can take advantage of on that target. So you'll have low or high. No specific preconditions. This would be low. We don't need any preconditions to be able to exploit this. Or high. We've got to have these conditions. We're not in control of them, but if they exist, then we can have a successful attack. Or maybe we need to complete some preparatory steps in order to get access. Or maybe we need to gather reconnaissance data. We need to overcome mitigations, or we need to become a man-in-the-middle attacker. These are things that we would have to do before the attack is successful. Then we have, what are the privileges required for this attack to be successful? So like, in order to exploit and have it work, you have to have some kind of privilege rating. None, you don't have to have any special privilege or special access for this attack to work. Like denial of service would fall under none. Or low, you just have to have a basic user level privilege. You don't need an admin privilege to pull this off. Or high, you need to be an administrator or something similar for the attack to be successful. And you can go and look at this and other websites to see more about these CVSS metrics. Now, the National Vulnerability Database, this tracks all this stuff. It's at nvd.nist.gov. It's a U.S. government repository of standards-based vulnerability management data. It contains SCAP specifications. It enables automation of vulnerability management, and it aggregates data to produce the scoring system, the weakness enumeration, and the platform enumeration. So the weakness enumeration would be like clear text passwords in general are very weak. Or the platform enumeration. Microsoft IIS 5.0 is in general very weak. So it aggregates the data to produce these scoring systems. The NVD doesn't perform actual tests. It aggregates data that it gets from others. Then we have the CVE, the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. This is a way of precisely identifying one vulnerability. And one vulnerability might morph. Each one of these different variations of the same vulnerability would get its own CVE number. Security experts, malicious hackers, ethical hackers, we all refer to the same CVE database so that we know exactly what we're talking about. This exploit works against CVE such and such. And you'll notice that CVEs are actually, they use a standard naming format. It says CVE dash the year that this vulnerability was discovered dash the vulnerability number, regardless of the product, the vendor, whatever. So this first one here, in 2018, this is the 8,475th vulnerability in the world that was discovered in 2018. And it happens to affect these versions of Windows, but the other discovered vulnerabilities may not have a thing to do with Windows. It could be totally other vendors, other products, so long as they're IT products. So this is CVE numbers. As we go along, you need to keep on top of vulnerabilities. You need to keep on top of what comes up, because vulnerabilities continue to bubble up and percolate up. We're never going to be free of vulnerabilities the way we do IT and the way we do networking, the way we use computers. So you need to stay on top of this, researching vulnerabilities. You need to gather information about security trends, new threats, new attacks. You need to discover system design faults, find weaknesses before they're attacked. Learn how to recover from an attack, because just like laying down a motorcycle, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So when you do have an attack, how do you recover from it? You can classify vulnerabilities by priority, severity, scope. You need to stay updated about new products, technologies, exploits. You can check underground hacking websites, deep and dark webs, for newly discovered O-Day attacks, vulnerabilities, and exploits. You could check for news releases, and I just get stuff in my inbox all the time. That's really good. So I can see news releases on security innovations, product improvements. You could have some fun and go to cvedetails.com. And there you can search by vendor, by product, by top 50, by different bulletins. So like right here, I can see Microsoft Windows Server 2019 vulnerability statistics. Well, in 2018, there were 54 vulnerabilities. 2 were denial of service, 13 code execution, 2 buffer overflows, 1 cross-site scripting, 5 that you could bypass something, 3 you could gain information, and you just click these, and you'll drill down until you get to the actual vulnerability, the actual CVE number with descriptions. It's a great place to go for vulnerability research. There are a ton of places you can go to research vulnerabilities, from SANS and CISA, CVE details, OWASP, Microsoft, dark reading, all the way down. Got a whole other page for you. They're all really good places to research vulnerabilities. So now we have seen vulnerability analysis. Let's move on. Let's review the key points about vulnerability analysis. You can perform vulnerability scans to identify weakness or lack of compliance. Scanning can be passive, where you're just sniffing, or active. Vulnerability scanning tools will focus on hosts, network devices, cloud services, or applications. Credentialed scans will give you usually more information than uncredentialed scans. SCAP scans are used to test a system for compliance. And don't forget the result types. The true positive, we really do have a vulnerability. Yay, we found it. The true negative, we really don't have a vulnerability. Whew, we patched everything up. The false positive, we're seeing vulnerabilities that don't actually exist. False alarm. And then the false negative, we do have vulnerabilities, we missed it. That's the worst. Vulnerability assessments should be both technical and non-technical. Go after not only the systems and the networks and stuff, go after people and processes. You should have an actionable report, something that we can use to fix things. The Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS, will rank severity on a scale of 1, meaning low, to 10, meaning the worst, the highest. CVSS identifies 4 attack vectors: network, adjacent, local, and physical. Network, we have to actually go across a couple routers, possibly even across the internet to attack. Adjacent, we're on the same network. Local, I actually logged into that device. Or physical, I'm physically attacking it. The NVD, the National Vulnerability Database, is a central repository of vulnerability information. A CVE, Common Vulnerability and Exposure, is an identification system to precisely identify one particular vulnerability. and everybody uses it. CVEs, if I refer to a CVE number, which would be CVE dash the year, and then what vulnerability number in that year, if I refer to something, both malicious hackers and ethical hackers know exactly the vulnerability I'm talking about. Vulnerability research is an ongoing process, and there are many sites and services dedicated to helping you keep up with the latest vulnerability information. And that's vulnerability analysis.